after a couple of years of being a libertarian and sort of flirting with, Rothbardian anarcho-capitalism, again, this would have been, like 2012, 2013, something like that. I realized after getting a little more familiar with Catholic social teaching that libertarianism, at least of the kind that I had been, interested in, was not compatible with Catholic social teaching. So I just kind of accepted, okay, I'm not going to be a libertarian anymore. But I didn't really have the arguments. I didn't really know why it was wrong. I just sort of accepted it on faith. I guess that was a grace to be able to do that. But eventually I came across some old blog posts you had written on the topic, and they were very helpful to me. And in particular, you had written a journal article on a critique of the libertarian theory of property rights. And that was such a great, helpful thing to encounter and sort of, understand why, why there were sort of holes in, Rothbard's reasoning about sort of property rights as the absolute principle, but behind all of political philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah, that now that you mention that, it's funny. It prompts in my mind the thought that so I came back into the Catholic Church toward the end of 2001 after having been an atheist for about a decade, and after I don't know 2, 3, 4 years, I don't remember exactly how long it was, but of a period of gestation, as it were, as I was kind of slowly working myself back into uh, the faith, but hadn't yet committed myself until late 2001. And in doing so, I was very highly influenced by Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy. That was one of the big influences on me. At the time, I was also a libertarian, and so in my very early Catholic days, I still thought that one could combine those. And my libertarianism was it was not of what you might call a social or cultural type. In other words, it wasn't that I thought that the ideal life was one of with the popular, at least the popular understanding of libertarianism would have it, of indulging in legalized drugs and that kind of stuff. I was never really interested in that. For me, libertarianism was
Right.
always a theory about government, not a theory about private morality. And so
That's right.
a libertarian position on something like that issue would be that even if drug use is immoral, which I always thought it was, even at the time, nevertheless, the government ought not to have any role in forbidding it or preventing it, and that it would be positively unjust, a violation of individual rights for it to do so. So that I
Right.
used to hold to that kind of libertarianism. But as time went on in my early years in the Catholic Church, and I started to think through more consistently the logical implications of taking an Aristotelian Thomistic natural law approach to ethics, and specifically the foundation that natural rights have, if you're looking at these issues from an Aristotelian Thomistic point of view, it just gradually became clear to me that there was no way I could reconcile a libertarian theory of natural rights with a Aristotelian Thomistic theory of natural rights. And moreover, it was clear to me that there were certain teachings of the church, such as, for example, the teachings of the popes from Pope Leo XIII onward, on the idea of a just wage and just prices and so forth, that you really couldn't reconcile with a doctrinaire libertarian position. When I say a doctrinaire libertarian position, by the way, just a little side note here, I don't mean that there's anything wrong with somebody giving arguments of an economic sort that market solutions are better than government solutions to this or that particular problem.
Right.
I'd say, okay, fine,
Right.
let's hear those arguments out. They're either good arguments or not, and there's nothing wrong with considering those sorts of market solutions to different problems. I have no problem with that, and I'm very favorable to a lot of those sorts of arguments. But what I mean by doctrinaire libertarianism is the view that you see in people like Murray Rothbard and Ayn Rand and Robert Nozick, at least the earlier Robert Nozick, that it would be strictly contrary to justice, because strictly contrary to natural rights, say, for government to say interfere with a market contract to work for a certain wage. That if the government, say, were to say that you had to pay X amount to your employees per hour, that would not only be, say, economically dubious, but it would be positively contrary to justice, that the employer has a natural right to charge whatever he wants, and the employee has a natural right to accept even if it's a bad deal, whatever wage is offered. That's the sort of idea that I came to see. Now, you really can't reconcile that. You really can't reconcile the libertarian position with Catholic social teaching on things like just wages. Now, of course, that leaves open, well, what would a just wage be, and how do you determine that? And that turns out to be pretty complicated, and some Catholics are way too glib on that question. But what I came to see is that this doctrinaire position that it would be positively unjust and positively contrary to natural rights for the state to have any say in that, I came to see you just can't reconcile that with either natural law theory or Catholic social teaching. And so that was wasn't the only consideration, but it was one of several considerations that led to me eventually abandoning libertarianism. And so sometimes when I have people these days tell me, because they don't like what I've written on capital punishment or something, they say, well, you're not willing to submit your intellectual will to what the church teaches. I think, what are you talking about? I mean, there have been other times where I've altered my position precisely because I could see that it wasn't reconcilable with what the church's teaching required of the faithful. And I don't dissent from anything binding on the issue of capital punishment or any other issue for that matter. But in any event, your comments on this earlier history of my thinking in political philosophy jogged this sort of train of thought. I hope you don't regret it. But
No, sure, yeah.
It's a set of issues I haven't thought about for a while, since it's been quite a long time since I was a libertarian or even really attracted to that sort of approach in political philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I was never able to, even at the height of my libertarianism, I could never quite take that step and agree with Rothbard that all rights were property rights. That just seemed way too monomaniacal to me, even at the time. And even though I couldn't come up with a positive argument for authority other than, church authority explicitly, God ordained church authority. I just had and also I just a very anti-authoritarian disposition from early childhood, that made it appealing to me. And also just the simplicity of it did appeal to me on some level, the philosophical purity of it, where it almost erodes all prudential questions away. And so you can just have everything laid out clearly in the abstract. That was very appealing to me and that's how ideology tends to be. I think that's part of the appeal of ideology. But then once I got rid of that, once I let go of that, I kind of realized, it wasn't just that I was letting go of libertarian. It was like, okay, ideology in general is not going to work for me because that's just not how these things work, you know?
No, that's absolutely right. And there is, especially in this kind of hardcore doctrinaire libertarianism that I'm describing, with Rothbard, Ayn Rand, Robert Nozick, things like that. Part of the intellectual and emotional appeal of it is precisely that it gives you a very simple, crisp, clear system and a very easy to use criterion for determining, okay, what's going to be my position on issue A, B, or C, or what have you. But political ideologies in general are like that, whether we're talking about Marxism or even really egalitarian liberalism of the John Rawls sort. They tend to really flatten out and simplify social reality. And as a result, you find, in my earlier days as a Catholic, when I would get into arguments with people about libertarianism, there was this reflexive tendency, and I understood it having been a libertarian, but there was this reflective tendency to think, okay, well, if you're rejecting, the Rothbard or Nozick line on natural rights and on property rights in particular and taxation and so forth, well, that means you're just really opening the door to any degree of state intervention that you like. And it's just a ridiculous conclusion. Of course, that doesn't follow at all.
That's what Rothbard does. Rothbard always says, like, okay, his big thing is showing that any specific line must be arbitrary, and therefore you can't really say anything for certain. Like, if he can take down a particular solution that you give as arbitrary, as not sort of strictly necessitated by economic or philosophical laws, then the whole thing must be just completely, open to any extreme position, Yeah.
Yeah, there is that tendency. And I would just say, well, I mean, you look at it, this all depends on what your theory of natural rights is. What is it that grounds natural rights? And, thinkers like Rothbard tend to say, well, it's ultimately self-ownership, but the idea of self-ownership actually presupposes rights rather than really being a ground of rights. But I would say, well, I mean, this is no surprise to you or any of your listeners who know my work, but the correct approach to grounding natural rights, including property rights, is an Aristotelian Thomistic natural law account, where rights have a teleological function. They exist in order to safeguard our capacity to perfect ourselves by pursuing the ends that natural law sets for us. Now, that gives very definite boundaries to what others can do to us, including the state. But the boundaries aren't quite as restrictive as a natural rights libertarian like a Rothbard or a Nozick or an Ayn Rand supposes. Uh, but again, they're operating with this very simplistic model where it's either, um, their position or it is socialism, and it's just it's a
Right.
false
Which was
dichotomy.
what Mises said.
Right? Yeah, he has. I think he has an essay. The middle of the road policy leads to dictatorship or something.
That's right.
Well,
Yeah, yeah.
okay. I mean, it doesn't. And let me explain to you why. And you can set out the principles that would prevent that from happening. But